Hi, Lyssa here. You know, I had a very interesting conversation today that led to this video, and it's really about how our biases can show up in coaching. And I was doing a training, one of my favorite trainings on playing with the power of metaphor, and one of the participants brought up something that I had not even noticed, which is such a wonderful awareness building opportunity, where apparently one of the common ways that I ask a question is, what does that look like for you? And it's sort of interesting because didn't even realize that I was asking this question around what does that look like for you? But it's a very visual perspective that I have. And I mean, I can unpack that a little bit. I got an undergraduate degree in photography. I tend to use my eyes a lot in the way that I look at the world, the way I pay attention to things. And it was like, oh, interesting. There's a bias that showed up. This bias can show up in lots of ways. It can show up in what we pay attention to and notice in the conversations that we're having with our clients. It can show up in the language that we're using. For me, what does that look like for you? For somebody else, it might be, what are you feeling right now? And I think for somebody else, it might be, what are your thoughts on that? And it's not that any one of those is wrong to use by any means, but that awareness that you're utilizing a language that is maybe an implicit bias of your own. And I think the third area where our biases can really get activated in a conversation with our coaching client is when we see the direction in the conversation that we think the client maybe needs to go. And at that point, we might become very leading. I think there are three competencies. Honestly, there's more than three competencies that can support you to be more aware, but these are the three that I'm going to talk about. Coaching mindset being the first one, cultivating trust and safety being the second, and then listening actively being the third. So let's take a look at coaching mindset. There are three elements of coaching mindset that can be so useful in helping us to become more aware. But this engaging in ongoing learning and development, it may come in the form of having a conversation with another coach where they make an observation about the language that you use, which gives you an opportunity to self-reflect, like, yeah, I am using that language and I'm doing it pretty unconsciously, something that maybe I need to be paying attention to. Having and developing an ongoing practice for reflection, though, is really important. A one-off here or there might be very useful, but having a regular practice, whether it is that you're listening to your own recordings and really getting clarity around the style of questions that you tend to ask, that could really be useful. And also just remaining aware of the context and influence of your own context and culture upon the way that you look at things and the way that you speak to things and the way that you think of things and the way that you feel about things. One of the things that came up in that conversation also was around the idea of trust and safety in the conversation. But before I go there, really, it's about getting comfortable with ourselves as far as being curious. I was in a mentor coaching group last night, and it came up in that mentor coaching group that there weren't all closed-ended questions, but there were a lot of closed-ended questions in the coaching demonstration. And it's sort of funny because it's like in my mind, when I was asking the questions, they felt open-ended. But when I'm looking at them on paper, black and white, I could see that I had let go of the how and the what, and there were more are and is sorts of questions. Not not a bad thing, but a good thing to be aware of. Am I getting into a comfort and rut in my own coaching where I'm not listening as consciously to the questions that I'm asking? Again, a really good place to be curious on our own behalf as coaches. And this really takes us into cultivating trust and safety, which is how do we create a a relationship in which the trust and safety is so high that regardless of the words that we use and the way that we ask the question, the client feels comfortable in redirecting us, saying yes, saying no, saying something else would work better. And so really, I'm working on understanding the client within the context that is their identity, their environment, their experiences, values, and beliefs. But I'm also really recognizing that they're also whole, capable, resourceful, creative too. So for instance, in this situation where I might have used the word, how does that look to you? And it's coming from my bias of visual perception. I have definitely had clients who, because their default is thinking or feeling, will just automatically come back with, well, I'm feeling whatever, or I've been thinking about it in this way. And so because there's enough trust and safety in the relationship that's been set up with permission giving to the clients to be at choice and always to be at choice, they'll course correct us, right? And so then we just go with the direction that they want us to go. I think there's also this around this ability also of in our culture, and I say our culture, I'm really talking sort of Western culture, and I think it shows up in other cultures too, but I'm really speaking to our culture right now, the one that I am part of. We are pretty comfortable with telling, which is why, you look at books like the coaching books around advice monsters, and it's really tough for people because we're solving for the problem, and so we see the direction and we start leading the client in that direction. And so that's a big part of how we are socialized to give value. And there is a real interesting thing that happens when you let go of that and you leave the choices to be empowered by the client versus being directed by the coach. And so I think there is something to really looking at our discomfort with letting our clients lead, putting the question back to them, when they say, I really want to have some tools before I leave this conversation today. And the coach says, where would you like to begin exploring the tools? Versus, so I hear you want tools, so let's start working on what tools are you already using. Instead of just assuming we know anything, we can cultivate more trust and safety with our clients by asking the question instead, which really ultimately leads to the third coaching competency that I think supports this checking out our own biases, which is listening actively and really listening to the client at a deep level, listening to the language they use, and whether it is summarizing what we've heard and asking a question, or whether it is really asking what the meaning is to the words that the client is using. It really fits with cultivating trust and safety, but it also is one of the ways that we, instead of assuming we know what the client means by something, what does it mean to have tools by the end of the session, we instead spend a lot more time exploring what's in the way of using the tools that they maybe already have, and what does that even mean to them? So I hope this was useful in thinking about how do we start to explore our own biases that are just implicit in the way that we show up in the world and be curious about them versus worried about them. We all have biases. If you have a brain, you're biased, but having that capacity to be curious on your own behalf is such an important part of your coaching, my coaching, and the coaching that really lights up the client's mind. So I hope this was useful, and I look forward to seeing you on another video.